China is gearing up to invade Taiwan. At least that's the impression you'll get if you've been paying attention to Xi Jinping since the beginning of 2024. Though China's president has repeatedly claimed that reuniting Taiwan with China is one of his priorities, his words since the beginning of 2024 indicate that China is on the cusp of an invasion. Take what he said during his New Year's address on January 1st as an example. In addition to calling Taiwan a sacred territory, Xi also claimed that the reunification of the motherland is a historical inevitability. More recently, Xi has apparently asserted that he wants the Chinese people to be ready for an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. That's according to Australian Lieutenant General Stephen Sklenka, who told ABC News that the West needs to take Xi at his word when he says that he believes Taiwan and China should be unified. Sklenka thinks that the increase of military activity throughout the East China Sea is indicative of a China that's preparing for a full invasion. And that invasion will likely come within the next 3 years. While a Chinese invasion of Taiwan will obviously have a massive impact on the Taiwanese people, that's not what this video is all about. Instead, we're going to focus on somebody a little closer to home. You. How would China invading Taiwan affect you personally? Before we can answer that question, it's worth digging deeper into the history between Taiwan and China to help you understand why an invasion is looking increasingly likely. The crux of the issue between the two lies in China's claims that Taiwan is historically a part of China. These are claims that Xi references in his New Year's address, though their historical validity can be called into question. The BBC says that historical sources suggest that Taiwan has indeed been under Chinese control at various points during its history, most notably during the 17th century when it fell under the control of the Qing dynasty. That control didn't last. By 1895, Taiwan had become a Japanese colony, the result of the Qing dynasty losing the First Sino-Japanese War. That Japanese control lasted until 1945 when Japan was defeated in the Second World War. Taiwan was restored to Chinese control, at least on paper. However, the island's new leadership, a nationalist government headed by General Chiang Kai-shek, took power. By this point, Chiang's political party, the Kuomintang, had spent around half a decade in conflict with Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, within the Chinese mainland. That conflict ended in 1949 with a CCP victory, causing Chiang and his Kuomintang to flee to Taiwan and establish rule there. The Kuomintang ruled Taiwan for several decades thereafter, and herein lies the reason for a possible invasion. To Taiwan, the establishment of Kuomintang rule essentially made the island a nation independent of China. Today, it has democratic elections and is treated as an independent state by many countries, though only 13 officially recognize Taiwan as its own nation. To many in Taiwan, the history of the country suggests that it was never part of the modern Chinese state that formed after Mao's revolution in 1911. It was under Japanese control at the time, and that it also never became part of the People's Republic of China, or PRC, that Mao formed in 1949. The CCP, on the other hand, has essentially never recognized Kuomintang rule in Taiwan as being official, which branches into it now not recognizing Taiwan as an independent or democratic state. Instead, it argues that Taiwan is a part of the PRC and has been since the PRC was formed. Hence the talk of reunification. To Xi, Taiwan is simply a part of China that is acting independently when it shouldn't. Despite these tense relations between the two, China has typically been somewhat subdued in its claims over Taiwan. Though its leaders have historically all claimed Taiwan to be part of China, most have done so under the guise of wanting a peaceful reunification. Xi himself has emphasized this at various points during his presidency, such as in his 2023 New Year's address, in which he called China and the Taiwanese people members of one and the same family, while urging both to work together for the lasting prosperity of the Chinese nation. His recent comments have taken a decidedly militaristic turn. Xi has gone from encouraging a peaceful resolution to saying Taiwan must be reunified with China. And if Lieutenant General Sklenka is to be believed, the reunification has now a deadline, 2027. Taiwan is unlikely to simply roll over and allow China to take control of an island that has essentially functioned as a democratic state for decades. That leaves Xi with just one option: an invasion. In essence, we see a similar situation to that playing out between Russia and Ukraine right now. Russia believes that Ukraine is rightfully part of its country, with President Vladimir Putin's invasion conducted based on the idea that he's simply reunifying Russia and Ukraine. China's attitude toward Taiwan is similar. The island should be a part of the PRC. So an invasion may be inevitable, which brings us back to the question that opened this video. How would that invasion affect you personally? There are several ways, with perhaps the most impactful coming down to one word: semiconductors. According to The Economist, Taiwan accounts for 60% of the world's semiconductors, a number that rises to 90% when you hone in on the advanced semiconductor market. These tiny little components are used in practically every electronic device since they play a crucial role in managing the flow of electricity in those devices. For that reason, they're used as part of the electronic chips made for computing components and devices, including smartphones and solid-state storage units. Semiconductors are so important that some refer to them as the silicon shield of Taiwan. Protecting its manufacturing capacity is vital because so many of the devices use them, with The Economist pointing out that the semiconductors are so crucial that they could give other nations a reason to jump to Taiwan's defense if China invaded. Perhaps you're already starting to see why a Chinese invasion would be such a problem. Forming a naval blockade around Taiwan would likely be one of the first actions that China takes in the event of an invasion. That would prevent the country from exporting a significant percentage of the semiconductors it produces, affecting supply chains around the globe. The invasion itself would also wreak havoc on manufacturing capacity. Taiwan would be forced to divert resources to defend itself. Not only would it be less able to get semiconductors out of the country, but it would also be forced to produce fewer of them. The result? A supply and demand crisis that would affect almost every electronic device. We've already had a taste of what this would mean, both for the global economy and everyday consumers. When the COVID-19 pandemic began, widespread lockdowns created massive supply chain issues that affected the global chip market. That shutdown couldn't have come at a worse time. As Tech Republic points out, demand for integrated circuits, which use the semiconductors, was growing long before the pandemic. That demand growth had already placed the semiconductor industry on shaky ground, which wasn't aided by the trade wars taking place between the US and China at the time. Taiwan was also affected by external influences during this period due to a drought that rocked the nation. Then the pandemic hit. The automotive industry saw the most obvious effects. Though it had started reducing its chip orders by 2020 due to reduced demand, allowing Taiwan Semiconductors to supply other industries, that year later brought with it a surge. The second half of 2020 saw vehicle manufacturers trying to increase their orders, placing more pressure on the semiconductor industry as demand started to outpace supply. Something had to break, and that break came in the form of price increases. That was seen in the consumer electronics sector, which was forced to raise prices as demand for appliances, computers, video game consoles, and mobile devices began to outstrip supply. That alone caused problems, as consumers were forced to grapple with higher prices for devices that were quickly running out of stock. The 2020 release of the PlayStation 5 or PS5 offers an excellent example. For over a year after that console's release, resellers were using bots to buy up stock so they could profit on the resale market. Business Insider spoke to one 22-year-old reseller during this period who purchased 221 PS5s at the then market value of $499.99. He went on to sell them at around $1,000 each, double their market value, allowing him to generate $40,000 in profit within a week. This is just one of the many examples of how those inside the US took advantage of the semiconductor shortage. And that brings us back to the potential invasion of Taiwan. Though semiconductor and chip supplies have been gradually recovering since around 2022, a war between China and Taiwan would cause them to plummet far further than the levels they were at in 2020. Up to 60% of the world's semiconductors would simply disappear from the market. This time, the effects would be felt on a much wider scale. In fact, several resources suggest that an invasion would tank the global economy. The conversation notes that many call Taiwan the most indispensable economy in the world thanks to its semiconductor production. If China were to break the silicon shield, it would impact practically every industry on the planet. A June 2023 report published by NBC News goes into greater detail. Speaking to Min Woo, the chief executive of the Taiwanese chipmaker Macronix, it discovered that an invasion could set the global economy back several decades. My opinion is, you will be set back at least 20 years, Wu told NBC. Malcolm Penn, who's the chief executive of Future Horizons, a semiconductor industry consultant, backs up Wu's claims, saying that the disruption to the global chip supply caused by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would bring the world to its knees. The shortage seen during the pandemic would seem like a walk in the park, as dozens of different industries would either find themselves scrapping over a much shorter supply of semiconductors, or in the case of the most advanced semiconductors, simply won't have what they need to build their products. Then there's the possibility of a Chinese victory to consider. China would take control of a huge portion of the global semiconductor industry, which would lead to devastating consequences for the United States. On a personal level, the products you buy would likely cost substantially more than they do right now. China would be able to name its price in trade negotiations, a power it might use to force American businesses to pay even more. It would also have the power to not only overcome sanctions placed against it by the US, but to create some of its own. After all, the US simply can't afford to not have a steady flow of semiconductors coming in. A chip shortage, either due to the invasion or Chinese control of the semiconductor industry, could also have an impact on your job. During the height of the pandemic-related shortage in February 2021, Al Jazeera published an interesting article that highlighted how much of an impact the shortage had on the American job market. It pointed out how the chip shortage had caused General Motors to shut down production at its Fairfax facility in Kansas City, with Ford also reducing shifts and limiting production at 2 of its factories. The resulting job losses had an immediate impact on state unemployment benefit applications. The U.S. Department of Labor reported 861,000 applications for the week ending February 13, 2021, nearly 100,000 more than the 765,000 applications it had forecast. Make no mistake about it, semiconductors are vital to the U.S. economy. If China invades Taiwan, there's a possibility that you may lose your job, especially as the impact on the global supply chain would be far greater than felt during the pandemic. Even if you remained employed, the cost of doing business will increase rapidly. New equipment such as laptops and smartphones will become harder to find and more expensive, which could result in even more unemployment as companies try to cut costs. And even as an everyday consumer, you'll likely see supply shortages across the board for any products that use semiconductors. These shortages could lead to the type of reselling and price gouging seen in the PS5 example being conducted on a wider scale. Cars, phones, computing equipment, even the AI technology that's becoming increasingly important in business and everyday life. All of it will be impacted, with the most powerful effects being felt in your pocket and your bank balance. Perhaps that's why the U.S. is trying to boost domestic manufacturing of semiconductors. NBC says that the U.S. is responsible for just 10% of the semiconductor manufacturing sector, and that it produces no advanced semiconductors, and it's trying to fix that problem. That's why it's offering tax incentives for projects such as the construction of a $40 billion production facility in Arizona. But even that facility is linked to Taiwan's leading chipmaker, TSMC, and having it won't instantly make the U.S. a world leader in semiconductor manufacturing. I would say at least 10 years, Wu commented when asked how long it would take to build such a complex industry in the U.S. A full decade during which the American economy and potentially your own bank balance and way of life would be directly impacted by China's invasion of Taiwan. But that semiconductor issue would be just one element of a far greater problem. The invasion could lead to the United States struggling in its efforts to combat climate change. In examining the potential fallout from a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, Dieter Helm, a professor of economic policy at the University of Oxford, points out that the invasion would have just as marked an impact on the energy industry as it would the semiconductor industry. Specifically, he mentions the United States and its net zero transition policies, which have grown increasingly dependent on China, not only for the minerals needed for manufacture related to those policies, but also for the wind turbines and solar panels that China produces. Bilawal Bhutto Zardari, Pakistan's foreign minister, agrees with this opinion, claiming that we won't be able to confront climate if the US and China don't work together. Again, we've seen hints of this already. In August 2022, China suspended the climate change-related talks with the U.S. in direct response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. The Ukraine war has also already had an impact on the net zero transition efforts. American and global focus has shifted toward energy security due to the oil and gas shortages that the war has caused, with sustainability falling on the back burner. Those problems would only intensify if China invaded Taiwan. China currently leads the world in the manufacture and sale of batteries, solar panels, and wind turbines. On the battery front, it's home to 6 of the 10 largest lithium-ion battery producers, which combine to give it 77% of the global market. The next closest manufacturers, Poland and the United States, only control 6% each. We see a similar situation in solar panel manufacturing. According to Wood Mackenzie, China looks set to control around 80% of the world's solar manufacturing capacity by the end of 2026. That alone leaves the US with little recourse but to rely on China for solar supplies to support its net zero initiatives. But when you add the fact that China's solar modules are 65% cheaper than those made in the US and 50% cheaper than those manufactured in Europe, there's even more reason for the climate conscious to worry. American businesses aren't going to want to absorb those increased costs, meaning they'll be passed on to consumers if the Chinese solar supply chain breaks down. Those consumers might include you. China isn't quite as dominant in the wind turbine manufacturing sector, though it is still the world's leading supplier, controlling 60% of the market. All of this control adds up to one thing: China is a vital player in the energy sustainability sector. Returning to Professor Helm, he suggests that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would cause immediate economic shocks. Investors would, quote, run for cover while the supply chains built around Chinese production over the last 30 years start to crumble. Financial markets would bear the brunt of the investor timidity, and it wouldn't be long before the dollar rises and the United States falls into recession. Inflation would follow, with direct impact being the cost of goods and services increased as suppliers have to spend more on non-Chinese products. It's a repeat of the semiconductor situation on a grander scale. Returning to the net zero issue, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have a clear impact on anybody who's interested in using solar panels to reduce their carbon emissions. The same goes for anybody who has a device that uses a lithium-ion battery, such as a smartphone, as those will become much harder to obtain. Why? Again, we can look at the Ukraine war. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States, along with dozens of other countries, implemented sanctions designed to limit the flow of trade in and out of Russia. It would likely do the same to China if it invaded Taiwan, with the downside being that these sanctions would have a much more powerful effect on America's economy. The energy industry, at least the sustainability sector, would suffer greatly due to reduced access to solar panels, batteries, and even wind turbines that they offer to consumers and businesses. As a result, you would have a far reduced access to those products. Worse yet, you'd be caught in a snowball effect that could force your energy bills to spiral out of control. A reduction in the availability of the equipment needed to achieve net zero would force the United States to place an even greater focus on energy security ahead of sustainability policies. That would lead to it being at the whims of the global oil and gas markets, the fluctuations in both having a defined impact on how you power, heat, and cool your home. You're already feeling the impact of those fluctuations due to the Ukraine war. Statista says that the average cost of 30 kilowatt-hours of electricity has risen from $4.02 in January 2020 to $5.19 in January 2024. The story is the same for gasoline and piped gas. The former has risen to $3.35 per gallon from $2.63 in the same period, with piped gas going from $1.07 per gallon to $1.45. Now, imagine that any access you have to sustainable and more cost-effective alternatives dries up. The U.S. sanctions China, resulting in China refusing to supply solar panels and other equipment that could help you avoid sucking at the fossil fuel teat. Electric vehicle manufacturing slows down because those manufacturers can't get the batteries or semiconductors they need for their vehicles. While solar installers would likely continue offering services, their panels would be subject to the same supply and demand economics that affect semiconductors, all of which would lead to limited access and higher prices. Even your electricity and gasoline generated from fossil fuels would likely increase, especially if the invasion took place against the continued backdrop of the Ukraine war. Again, the United States recognizes the problems inherent in relying so heavily on China. It's introduced the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Act, all combining to try to boost America's critical mineral and refining supply chains, so it doesn't have to buy as much from China. The U.S. is also in the advantageous position of having fossil fuels at home, which has resulted in it supplying the European Union with 50% of its liquefied natural gas. Still, the point remains. If you're at all concerned about climate change, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would have a huge impact on you and on a wider scale the rest of the planet. Trade in the sector would follow, exacerbated by the semiconductor issue, to force an increased reliance on fossil fuels at a time when many are trying to move away from them. Ultimately, the reliance would hit you in your pocket. Your energy costs would still be linked to oil and gas prices. Let's look at the wider trade issue. Beyond semiconductors and energy, how much of an impact would a Chinese invasion have on America's economy? Catastrophic is the word that comes to mind. In an August 2022 article, Yahoo Finance senior columnist Rick Newman examined the impact that trade disruption caused by such an invasion would have. He first explained the issue that the Ukraine war had caused by that point, noting the damage to global energy markets and even food shortages created in some countries. Energy bills had skyrocketed, America's economy had been weakened, and the war set the stage for marked increases in inflation and interest rates. Before the Ukraine war began, America's total trade with Russia and Ukraine amounted to a combined $40 billion per year, all of which was jeopardized by the war. Taiwan exceeds that total by nearly 300% alone. The country's trade with the United States amounts to $113 billion, with Taiwan providing billions of dollars of semiconductors, machinery, base metals, vehicular equipment, and chemicals, along with other smaller goods. As for China, its trade with the U.S. in August 2022 amounted to a staggering $656 billion per year. Combine the two, and you have $769 billion, over 19 times the amount of trade between the U.S. and both Russia and Ukraine combined before the Ukraine war. Where Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused an economic shock that was felt throughout the country, particularly in the energy and consumer goods sectors, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would cause a metaphorical earthquake. Over $750 billion worth of trade would be thrown up in the air, with Newman claiming that such a war would deal a massive blow to the U.S. prosperity. He quotes RAND figures that suggest that any war involving China, particularly one in which the U.S. takes part, would immediately slash 5% of America's $23 trillion economy. For context, the Great Recession that began in the wake of the 2008 global financial crisis, or GFC, knocked 2.6% off the economy. So economically, the United States would be staring down the barrel of an economic gun that would be twice as powerful as the GFC. Again, that amounts to everything we've spoken about so far in relation to you. The costs of goods and services will rise both due to supply and demand issues and the inflation that a Chinese invasion would cause. Unemployment would likely increase too, as it did during the GFC, with the affordability issues created by such an economic shock likely also affecting the housing market. Who knows how long it would take for the world's financial markets, as well as its supply lines, to recover in the wake of a war. After all, even a Chinese victory would leave China severely weakened. Newman quotes Rand's suggestion that China's gross domestic product would plunge by 25% in the event of an invasion, with that decline aided by sanctions implemented across the country. It's not like the global economy could simply pick up where it left off following the invasion. Finally, there's one more aspect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan that we've yet to cover: direct U.S. military involvement. Though the U.S. doesn't have a direct or official military relationship with Taiwan, it still considers the island one of its key partners in the Indo-Pacific. The Department of Defense says the two countries have a robust, unofficial relationship, which could manifest in America becoming involved in any war that breaks out between Taiwan and China. After all, that's the entire point of the Silicon Shield. Taiwan is so crucial to the American economy that it can't afford to allow China to take control of the island. Perhaps that's why President Joe Biden claimed that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion back in September 2022, a comment that drew condemnation from Beijing. But even if Biden essentially had to backtrack that claim, he appears to have the support of a large segment of the American people. That's according to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which noted in August 2021 that 69% of Americans support recognizing Taiwan as an independent country. This directly contradicts China's approach to the island. A majority of 53% also say they support the idea of America forming an official military alliance with Taiwan, while 46% explicitly claim to support sending American troops to defend the island if China invaded. Of course, the U.S. going to war could have a market effect on you personally. Even if we discount the economic shock that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would cause, anybody who's part of the military, particularly the U.S. Navy or Air Force, might have to travel to Taiwan to fight against China. The loved ones of those military members would also obviously be impacted, especially given that war game scenarios suggest that any American fight against China in the waters surrounding Taiwan would come at a great cost to the U.S. That was reported in The Guardian in January 2023, which said that the U.S. getting involved in the invasion would also draw Japan into the fight. China would retaliate. American air bases in Japan and Guam would become targets for Chinese missile attacks. Furthermore, the war games also suggest that China would be able to sink at least 2 American aircraft carriers and up to 20 destroyers and cruisers in the ensuing naval battle. The United States would come out on top, successfully defending Taiwan in the process. But you might lose your life if you're part of the American military, or just as tragically, you may lose a loved one in the fighting, against all the backdrop of an American economy that's been brought to its knees. However, this is a worst-case scenario. It's possible that the impact of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan wouldn't be quite so severe, especially if China is able to win quickly to minimize trade disruption and prevent the US from getting involved at all. That only leaves us with one question to ask. How do you think you'd personally be affected if China invaded Taiwan? Are you in an at-risk industry that could see massive job losses due to semiconductor shortages? How much of an impact do you believe an invasion would have on energy and consumer goods prices? And do you think the US would step in to actively defend Taiwan in an invasion scenario? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching this video.